bighorn sheep in Nebraska itself, I wanted to touch a little bit on the history of bighorn sheep across the United States. So take a look at this map, and especially on the left-hand side, that specific map, goes back to the year 1850, and you can see that bighorn sheep were pretty widespread across the western part of the United States, even going up into Canada and down into Mexico. And if you look at the center map, going back to 1960, you can see a lot of those areas are now vacated, and most of the bighorn sheep, were gone from much of their historic range at that time. But by 2012, on the right-hand side of the map, you can see through relocations and conservation efforts, we started to fill in some of those gaps, across the country, but certainly nothing like what it was historically. As far as bighorn sheep in Nebraska go, they were extirpated from the state by the early 1900s, and that was primarily due to unregulated hunting, habitat loss, and also disease. With Nebraska's conservation efforts, it has been and continues to be to establish a self-sustaining, free-ranging bighorn sheep population in all areas of suitable habitat within the state. But how and when did it all begin for us here in Nebraska? Well, believe it or not, back in 1979, a habitat suitability study was done in the Pine Ridge region, which is up in the very northwest corner of the Nebraska Panhandle. And that study did show that there was actually still suitable habitat for bighorn sheep in the state. And so at that time, around 1980, a 500-acre enclosure was built within that habitat. And that was done at Fort Robinson State Park, which is also in the northwest corner of the state there. And in 1981, the first sheep were brought back into the state, from Custer State Park, just to the north in South Dakota. And so they didn't have a big distance to travel, but it started out with just a small number of 6 sheep. So, and through those propagation efforts, we were able to do fairly well within that captive facility. And by 1998, there was enough that 23 were released from the facility, and by 1993, all remaining individuals within that facility were released, and that enclosure was then taken down. And we kind of went with just that herd, until around 2000. So when we started exploring other options for more sheep in other parts of the state, and it was decided that, and habitat suitability studies were done in other areas as well, but it was decided to go ahead and start bringing more sheep in, and we did that in the year 2001, and then again 2005, 2007, and 2012. And these efforts didn't involve a captive facility. They actually just involved going and getting sheep from some state and bringing them back and kicking them out in those suitable habitat areas. So we've had a number of releases, as you can see, and relocations, since that Fort Robinson herd first began. And this is what it looked like right now. So currently we have 3 subherds up in that Pine Ridge region, which is demonstrated here in green, up in the very northwest corner of the state, and then also down in the Wildcat Hills, which is the southwest corner of the Nebraska Panhandle. We have 2 subherds down there, which is demonstrated there in blue. We still have a number of issues that face us with population recovery. Predation seems to be negligible most of the time, but when you get to low-level populations, it does become more of a concern. Habitat loss, through fragmentation, development, and urban expansion, those are all concerns. Land use changes is a concern. 97% of the land in Nebraska is privately owned, so there's always these changes across the landscape that we have to work with. And then, of course, fire suppression is another one that's a concern. But the number one overarching enemy of bighorn sheep, I guess, is disease. It still is with us and has been with all the states virtually that deal with bighorn sheep. And these are primarily due to disease events or pneumonia-related events through these bacteria that are often referred to as mycoplasma or Pasteurella-type bacteria. These infections are generally in the lung tissue, and they can cause labored breathing, coughing, nasal discharge, and lack of energy in the sheep, but ultimately they usually cause death. Unfortunately, they impact the entire herd. All age classes are susceptible to this disease. You know, and unfortunately too, you know, most of the time you could probably recover from these events, but what has happened with most of the herds that have gone through these disease events, you suffer with poor lamb recruitment for years and sometimes decades to follow, mainly from those that had lived through the event, you know, seem to carry it and then pass it on to the younger generations. This is something we've definitely observed in the Pine Ridge in particular. Last few years, we've definitely seen low to zero lamb recruitment in all three of those suburbs in the Pine Ridge, ultimately leading to declining herd populations. And if you look at the graph here, you can see that the Fort Robinson herd in particular, where we started it all, actually got to a high of 140 sheep, you know, until about 2005, 2006, when it crashed and we lost almost 50% to that first disease event in that herd. And then we've had a few follow-up disease events since that time. So you can see the fluctuation in the population, but definitely a steady decline. Where are our populations at right now? Here's a look at those in the Pine Ridge herds. Fort Robinson herd, you know, we're down to 20 individuals. As I mentioned, you know, it was up near 140 at one time. Barrel Butte herd, which is a little closer to Chadron, a little east of Fort Robinson, that's around 19 or 20. That also was up over 100 at one time. And our Sowbelly herd, which is our newest herd up in the Pine Ridge, was also over 100 at one time and is down near 10. So they really struggled in that Pine Ridge region due to these disease events. Wildcat Hills that I mentioned is down in the southwest part of the Nebraska Panhandle. A little bit different story down there. Our Cedar Canyon herd, which is southwest of Scotts Bluff, Nebraska, is currently at the 66th for population, which is actually its highest ever. Despite a disease event that went through this herd back in 2006 and cut those numbers in half. You know, they hovered around 30 to 35 individuals for almost 10 years because they suffered the effects of poor lamb recruitment and so forth. But recently, we've seen this kind of turn around with this herd, and they've began to increase again. And so it looks like maybe we've lost some of those disease carriers out of that herd, and so they're seeing some recovery on their own. But then we also got the Hubbard's Gap herd, which is southeast of Scottsbluff, Nebraska. This is one that we've kind of referred to as our rock star herd. I haven't had any major issues with them yet, you know, and they've kind of gotten through some of the surrounding disease issues. And so we're optimistic that we'll be able to keep going with that, but also knock on wood. But, you know, we're right near 200 sheep in that particular herd. So they've done quite well. But with a lot of these declines that we've seen, especially in the Pine Ridge, we initiated and developed some research projects, particularly with South Dakota State University, looking at reproductive success, survival, and cause-specific mortality in some of these bighorn sheep herds. And one theory or hypothesis that we were testing is removing these chronic shedders. And we classify these chronic shedders as those ewes that test positive 2 or more times for carrying these disease pathogens. This is something that South Dakota did as well and seemed to have good results with removing chronic shedders from their Custer State Park herd, where they actually had the same type of disease events. So the idea behind removing these chronic shedders is to then increase lamb survival. So as I mentioned, it seemed fairly effective and has gone fairly well in South Dakota, but how did it go in Nebraska? Well, I'll touch on that in just a minute, but did want to mention that in terms of the chronic shedders and removing them, we did identify 4 in our Barrel Butte herd and 5 in our Fort Robinson herd in 2019, and then 1 again in 2020. And most of those were transported to South Dakota State University, where they became part of a captive herd and remained a part of the study during that time. So again, getting back to what happened after we removed the chronic shedders from the herds in the Pine Ridge and how did that affect the lamb survival? Well, in 2019, at the Fort Robinson herd, we had 1 of 10 radio-collared lambs that survived, but we did notice that most of this was to predation and not so much to pneumonia like we had been seeing in the past. Barrel Butte herd, however, 5 of 6 collared lambs survived, so it looked like it was more effective over in that herd. And then the other herd part of the research was the Hubbard's Gap herd down in Wildcat Hills. We did not identify any chronic shedders there, so did not have to remove any. Their lamb survival and recruitment stayed pretty good. As for 2020, how did it look? 1 of 7 collared lambs at Fort Robinson survived. Again, predation was the highest cause of death, and not too much in the way of pneumonia. Barrel Butte, unfortunately, more predation this year than they had last year. And then Hubbard's Gap herd, again, did about like last year, remained pretty good there. Primary losses overall were to coyotes, a couple to lions and bobcats as well in terms of predation. But through the period, or the study period, over the course of 2 or 3 years, 16 radio collared ewes were lost, and 10 of those in the Pine Ridge and 6 of those in the Wildcat Hills, and most of those were lost to lion predation. We did have a few losses to pneumonia, but that was generally before the removal of those chronic shedders. So this part of the project actually is going to conclude. It's about done, but it'll conclude in May of 2021. So there will be more results coming ahead, with this aspect of the study. Here's just some pictures of some ewes and lambs I threw in. This is down in the Wildcat Hills, an area we appropriately named the Sheep Mountain. It sounds like historically there was a lot of sheep in this area, and they sure love it still today. And here's just a picture of some of the lambs. There's very, very sure-footed, for even at a young age like this, to get around those cliffs pretty darn well. There's also another component to the research. This was also at South Dakota State University, looking at disease prevalence in domestic sheep in the Nebraska Panhandle. We've had a lot of interest in participating in this part of the project too, with 34 producers that have jumped on board. We've collected a lot of samples with domestics as well, 330 nasal swabs, 31 throat swabs. And with this information, we plan to compare those bacteria and strain types to those in wild sheep to see if there's any connection or possible transmission between the two species. So more information will be coming in that in the future. Another component of this is a human dimensions type survey, also going out to these producers and seeing what kind of interest they may have in helping us further try to solve this problem and find mutually agreeable solutions for both species. This project's going to go on a little bit longer yet, so we got probably a year or two before we'll finish with this particular component of the project. University of Nebraska-Lincoln was also involved looking at spatial ecology and resource selection in bighorn sheep ewes. What they found is that home range and movement was larger in the Pine Ridge sheep than in the Wildcat Hills, and likely due to roads, people interactions, a lot more public land up in that Pine Ridge region than there is in the Wildcat Hills. With that in mind, and this greater dispersal and greater home range and movement likely does increase the disease risk with those sheep up there. This project is pretty much done, but there's some analysis being done yet, and so that we'll look forward to getting more of those results and probably as we get into 2021. But I want to touch a little bit more on this pneumonia events and these bacteria that have been identified over the years through Nebraska and even through other states. There seems to be about 4 strains of bacteria that kind of dominate with these disease events. Mycoplasma pneumoniae is one that's been found more recently, probably in the last 10 to 20 years, that is believed to be a leading culprit, I guess, in some of these disease events. And but others that have been around or identified a lot longer include Mannheimia hemolytica, Viruspania triolosi, and Pasteurella multocida. So these 4, like I say, have been around a while and seem to be contributing most of the time through any of these losses that occur. But specifically talking about Mycoplasma pneumoniae, it seems like its presence alone does not cause the pneumonia. For most of what we're finding, there's either more of these bacteria, like what are some of those I just mentioned, in conjunction with the Mycoplasma pneumoniae, or perhaps a stress factor that contributes to these losses. But definitely when this Mycoplasma pneumonia is present. It seems like it's more severe and more widespread when we have these events. Here's just a look at the, I guess, kind of the tree of through some serotyping or strain typing that we've done with the Pine Ridge herds up there. We've taken this mycoplasma and broken it down even further, through the help of Washington State University, identifying these strain types within these herds. And unfortunately, we've found 4 different strain types of this mycoplasma bacteria that appears to be fatal within these herds. It's bad enough just to have one, but we unfortunately got 4 that we've identified in these herds up north. So it makes it much more difficult to deal with when you're dealing with multiple strains like this. Again, sticking with this Mycoplasma pneumonia and something else that we found, the research showed that it was detected in all pneumonia positive individuals. So, and it was not found in any of the healthy individuals that we captured or in some of the mortalities that weren't related to pneumonia. So, definitely seemed to be a fairly strong connection with this Mycoplasma pneumonia. Despite some of these setbacks that we've had over the years with disease in particular, we have had some successes along the way. And those include being able to harvest some of these bighorn sheep runs. Hunting is a part of our bighorn sheep program, and we've been pretty successful with that aspect. Here's some of the folks that from our 2019 hunt, a couple of our permit holders. I got some real nice rams, one of which was up in the Barrel Butte herd there on the left. Frank Tritz got his out of the Barrel Butte herd near Shadron, and then Trevor Premer, he got his down the Wildcat Hills. So we've had a season actually since 1998, and this was the 26th and 27th ram that has been harvested over the years. As far as a recommendation goes for 2021, our commission just approved 2 permits for 2021, and that was primarily due to the fact that despite these setbacks, we still do have a total population between the 2 regions of about 300 bighorn sheep. We have a good number of mature rams out there yet, and so we were able to authorize 2 permits for 2021. But for this year, we just have 1 permit, and that has gone to a Nebraska resident who was a lucky recipient of this draw. And so he'll be joining us in December for a hunt in any of these herds which are eligible. Interesting note, I guess, that we've noticed here in recent years, through the hunting aspect, the application pool has increased. This year, for the 1 permit that we had over 3,100 applicants, and the only time that's ever been beat was the very first hunt ever in 1998. Which was over 3,400 applicants. So it's been interesting to see the increase in applicants for this permit, even though sometimes there's only 1. It's been interesting, in particular, the last 2 years that's gone up. Here's just some rams that I'm going to show you. You see this on the original picture and screen when I started too. This is one of the rams that's still out there. He's pretty photogenic. We get lots of pictures of him, and he just stands there for us and cooperates, I guess. So, but he's in that Barrel Butte herd up there by Shadron, but looking pretty good. And this is just another picture of him too. So he's still out there roaming around, but and with the rut coming on, I'm sure he's going to be an active part of that here in the days ahead. This is another ram, that's over at Fort Robinson herd. He's an old guy. He's run the gauntlet over the years. We've actually tagged him at a young age, so we know his age, and he's 14 years old. Actually, has lived longer than average for most rams, and so he's still out there too. And there's a picture back from April, and so yeah, he's hung in there well over the years. Here's some pictures of the rams down in the Wildcat Hills. You can see here some of these got a flair to them, something unique about those down there in the Wildcats. They've produced this flair, so they got some definite character to their horns down there. And some of them, others down there too, are just super heavy. This one's broomed off quite a bit too, but you know, they got a lot of mass to them, and quite the animal, and quite the neck muscles and skull plate to carry those heavy horns around. As far as the future goes for bighorn sheep management in Nebraska, you know, we recently, a number of us, you know, revised the bighorn sheep management plan. It hadn't been done for a while. We just finished that up and got that approved in August of 2019. There's several components and objectives to that, but one will be to continue with disease surveillance. Again, trying to get to these losses or mortalities in a timely manner, you know, continue with the sampling efforts that we do, and of course, continuing to get those lab results and identify those pathogens that we're dealing with. We plan to continue assessing these respiratory pathogens as well, and also consider potential treatment options along the way as we can. Other components of the plan too, also we'll be looking to continue on with population counts, evaluating lamb recruitment in each of these herds, looking again at harvest recommendations for possible hunts and recreational opportunities, consider other research as we deal with these mortalities and disease events, and also an educational component, you know, which helps share the information about what's really going on with bighorn sheep and the challenges that we face. But also, you know, it ultimately leads to the hope of considering future transplants and augmentation of the existing herds to try to bolster some of these populations. So with that, I'm going to close with some questions here, but I've got a video I'm going to show you here coming up. But sometimes, like I was saying earlier, my computer doesn't seem to like Zoom, but I'm going to click on it here. It's just a cute, kind of interesting, neat little video clip of the bighorn sheep on a haystack playing King of the Mountain, so to speak. So I hope it works here, but here we go. This was a haystack that was left out by a landowner down the Wildcat Hills a few years ago. This was late winter, early spring, and they were feeling pretty spry, I think, that day, and just having a little fun. And essentially playing King on the Mountain, like I said, on this little haystack. So.
That's great, Todd. That gives a whole new meaning to the words party animal. So that's cool. I like it. We do have some really good questions from some people.